I like to have at least a little bit of a horizon line. That horizon line I'm going to really treat as pretty much like down here at the bottom of the tree lines. I've got that sort of mountain ridge or mountain line that I'm just going to put in the background over there. And that's, for the most part, I think all I'll really need as far as drawing. I'm going to throw in just a little line for the edge of the riverbed, just to kind of give me a little bit of a sense of where I'm going to put water, ground, mountain, sky. Then, as far as the painting goes, I just got to set up my palette for a second. But the rule of thumb not just painting with gouache or watercolor, but really painting in general, is you always kind of want to paint thin to thick. So, as you're using gouache, you're going to see that there are moments and times where you really want to kind of paint stuff really thin and watery to kind of cover a lot of area. There'll be other times where you want to use it relatively thick to really cover up. And because of that, what I'll tell you is that the thin stuff first, the thick stuff later on. If you end up laying something down in the beginning of the painting thick, well, it's hard to go over thick paint with anything but more thicker paint. And it really kind of screws up the entire thing. So try to keep what you're doing thin first and then thick. General rule of thumb for me is start with the background and work from the back to the front. So things like the sky, that mountain in the back, stuff like that, that's going to be the first things that I paint. And I'm going to work my way from basically all the way back here towards the foreground. Light to dark, painting light to dark also. So I will do my lighter colors first, knowing full well that essentially dark colors they really cover a lot more. So, you don't want to come in with like black, dark green, dark brown. You don't want to come in with those colors too soon or too early into the painting, because you're not going to be able to sort of cover those things up. And really, those are the ways it goes. So thin to thick, light to dark, background to foreground. Having a little trouble. I guess my tubes are a little old, so my white isn't really coming out. I'm just going to use a little bit more water with it. I'm going to start with the sky. Rules of thumb, you want to kind of keep it to the idea that if you need to like lower the intensity of a color, let's say, you would pretty much just use the opposite of it. In this case, I'm really going to start off by using it very, very watery, just to kind of use it almost like a watercolor, just to get like a little wash up here. For a big area where I want to kind of cover it really sort of consistently and smoothly, I'm going to go and I'm going to take a clean brush and I'm going to wet the paper down first. By wetting the paper down first, it kind of opens up the paper a little bit to accept the paint a little bit easier. The key with watercolor or gouache or anything for that matter is, you don't want to work completely soaked. You want to find that fine line between, like, the paper is, you can see, kind of getting a little shiny and slick, but the paper is also not beating up with water. I don't think it's ever the right move to have like a puddle of water on your paper. And give it a second to kind of soak into the paper, that the glossiness kind of goes away. And then if we look the atmospheric perspective, and atmospheric perspective generally means that haze that you see along the horizon means that it'll always be slightly more colorful or darker the higher you go up in the picture plane, and the closer you are to the horizon, the lighter it'll get. Now, I mixed mostly water with just a touch of blue, and it's always easier to add more color. So what I'll do while everything's wet, I'm just going to dip just a little bit more. There we go. And I'm going to work this into the paper while everything is still fairly soaked. Now, the one thing about doing a big area like this on wet paper is that you really don't want to overwork the paper. So I am going over this quite a bit, but I'm going to leave that alone in a second. to kind of just soak in and dry in. If I keep going after it, what's going to happen over there is pretty much is the paper is going to start coming apart on me. So regardless of what kind of paper you use, and again, even with higher quality paper, it holds up a little bit better. But no matter what you use, if you're using water on the best of watercolor paper, eventually you're going to beat it up. Now I've taped all the way around, so it kind of keep the paper from bubbling up too much. But if you get water that sort of builds up in the corners on the tape, just grab a little paper towel and kind of take some of that off. I want to let that just sink into the paper a little bit, because I don't want it to kind of bleed into my mountain. I want a nice, clean, crisp edge for my mountain, which means I want dry paper. Now, do I have to wait a half an hour for dry paper? No, I don't think so. I'm going to do now is a setup for my mountain. And mountain, to me, in this particular picture, it looks a little bit more purple-ish. So I'm just squeezing out a little bit of red. Optically, and you'll learn this in color theory when you go to college, is that, you mix red and blue, you get purple. And with the right mixture of those two, you can get almost any color of purple. And that's how things work optically. But in practical sense of using actual paints, that's why they make different color paints, because not every blue and every red together is going to make the same sort of tone. So it's good to have a variety of those. Just like I said before, thin to really thick. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start with a very watery sort of mix. And again, I'm trying to cover up big areas. I'm trying to use pretty much a large brush. I got a lot of paint on there. What I'm going to do, since a lot of this is going to get covered with trees, is that I'm going to really just dip my brush in water and kind of work the rest of that out, so it's sort of faded. And really, in this first part of the painting, especially in the light things, I really kind of want to get rid of the white of the paper, especially in some of these areas. What I can do is, as this is sort of sinking in, I can pick up just a little bit more color. And what I can do is kind of come in before the paper is totally dry. Just kind of get a little bit more value to my edge over here. Realize that if I wait for that paper to completely dry, you'll see all my sort of brush strokes. I'm gonna go in there and there's probably just a little too much paint. Well, what I'll do is I'll just kind of run some of that at the top of my mount. Brush off. Dipping my brush in just a little bit of water to loosen things, and I'm just going to leave that alone for right now. All right, now since I also have these blues still out, and I'm pretty much in this sort of like light blue phase, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit down over here with my sort of riverbed. I'm going to come in first. My brush doesn't have to be super clean, but I'm going to wet this paper down because I really want a very smooth, glassy kind of wash over this. And I'm going to keep it relatively light. I'm going to wet the paper down just a little bit, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of the same blue that I mixed up for the sky, because essentially it is the sky that's being reflected back down on the riverbed. And what I'll do is I'll add, and you can see, like, I'm not really using a ton of paint. I'm using it very watery, and that is the right way to approach these things in the first sort of stage. And really, we're just kind of trying to establish just a little bit of base color in there. Now, what I'm going to want to do here for the ground is I want to get some sort of base value, something that I can work with in terms of like, well, it's just not just plain white, because I don't really have plain white happening on the ground over there. A lot of different options I could go with. Again, I think I just kind of want to get rid of the white of the paper before I do any sort of the detail work. And we're starting off obviously always that thin, again thick. I'll take a little bit of, I don't have a full array of colors, so what I'm doing is I'm taking this sort of yellow ochre mustard color. I'm adding just a little bit of red to make it a little browner, and I'm going to work with that with a lot of water. And really I'm just going to kind of give all this just a light wash. Just to kind of, again, like I said, get rid of the white. If this was an acrylic painting, you would consider this something called an underpainting. I'll use a little bit over here too. Just again to kind of get rid of the whiteness, because if you start like what you did before with like the tree trunks and then even like branches over top of the white paper, you're never going to go back in there and paint in between all the leaves and trunks and everything else like that to get rid of that original white. And the white, unless you have a snowy sort of landscape that you're going to do, doesn't really make sense to have it that way. All right, I've got my first layer here. Everything's kind of soaking in a little bit and sort of drying into the paper. The sky up here is kind of okay right now to start with. So the next thing I'm going to do is I think I'm going to come in and start working with the yellow. Why the sort of yellow trees and stuff next? Well, mainly because I want to do the lighter colors first. So I'm going to switch from that big, large sort of flat brush, and I'm going to switch over to maybe a medium-sized round brush. I think that for some areas that are supposed to look more organic and like blotchy and things like that, you're going to want to use, a round brush. The round brush is going to give you a little bit more of a natural look. I'm going to get a little bit of some brighter yellow gouache, and I'm going to use that along with some of that mustard color that I have. And I'm going to let this kind of be a little soupy and messy. But what I want to do is kind of paint a little bit of almost like a little yellow, splotchy yellow cloud. A blob, which is going to, serve as just a little bit of a background, or just a sense of like where that yellow color is going to go. And it's going to kind of mix in a little bit with the blue back there, and it's going to kind of get a little green, but that's okay because that's really what I'm seeing in the picture. So starting off with just some cloudy blotches and blobs of essentially sort of where I want those yellow trees to be. And this is all really just going to be like underpainting. This is all going to get covered up a bit. We're going to kind of put a little bit of just a touch of color in some of these areas. And again, I'm still going relatively thin with my paints. I've got some yellow that's going to be coming up all around. I'm touching here and there throughout my sort of landscape. So what I want to do is just kind of hint at a little bit of that. And again, I'm not painting leaves. I'm not painting texture. I'm just giving myself some background color. I'm going to switch over now, and I'm going to do the same thing with a little bit of green. With the green, what I can do is, if my green is really sort of like an unnaturally bright green, which my gouache actually is, I can mix that in with a little bit of red. and the red and the green are opposites, and that's going to give me a much muddier and darker green, and maybe something that's a little bit closer to what's going on with those trees. That first level of that I'm mixing in, I've got taken a little bit of this really bright green, I took a little bit of the red top here, mixing in some of that sand and yellow, and just kind of muddying it up over here. It's hard to see on the video, but this is really sort of like a fluorescent green, and this is sort of really much more of an earthier and grass green. And again, we use that round brush, wet, and I'm not painting leaves or anything else like that, but what I want to do is I just kind of want to map in a little bit of color back in here in the areas where I'm going to have trees. I'm not going to go up over here or higher than that. What I want to do is that if you look down in this part of the picture, you got a lot more dense forest, and we're going to make the trees bigger than these blotches. But what I'd like to do is just try to get a little bit of filler color in there and some stuff like that. So I'm just going to pat a little bit of that into this area, and all I'm really doing is dividing up where I want greenery. And some over here. And it's okay, this should, even though I've kind of mixed the sort of, you know, military green kind of, you know, tree green color, I don't want it to be super thick or super dark. And it doesn't really even matter if what I'm doing looks like trees yet or not. We'll get to that fairly soon as this stuff starts drying. All right, so I've got kind of a little bit of a roadmap. I've got my sky. My sky's pretty much done. That mountain range, that's pretty much it. My water, base of my water is there, but I'm going to come back in there in a minute and add a little bit more of those I guess sort of reflections in there. Actually, you know what? Now's not the worst time to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my big thick brush. I've got it pretty much clean, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of wet the paper down with just some clean water. I'm going to overly work it because I don't want to wipe off or lift off the paint that I've already done there, but that really probably shouldn't happen because it was a pretty thin coat. And so I've got my paper just in the area where the riverbed's going to be, a little bit wet. Kind of just dab up a little bit. I'll let that soak in for just a second. I'm going to grab that round brush that I was working with before. I'm going to work some of that little bit of yellow that I was using a minute ago. And what I want to do is I kind of want to do some underpainting in here for my reflections. So how do I do that? I want it nice and kind of sort of wet. The way the trees are going to kind of hit the water and create that blur, I'm going to let it bleed into the paper just a little bit. And what I'm going to do is just try to add a little bit of yellow mark, and I'll be vertical, sort of up and down sort of marks. And what I'll do is I'll let that just kind of sink in just a little bit. I'm going to take a nice flat brush. I can use the same one I was using before, but this time what I want is I want to, if it's wet, I want to dry it off, or I want to just use a clean dry brush. Before this stuff kind of gets too sunken in the paper, you can kind of just pick up a little bit of that paint and kind of just pull it downwards a little bit and kind of smear it a little bit, and that's going to give it that sort of effect. I can even pull side to side with that dry brush. I can make a couple little ripples in that. Grab another round brush. I'm going to go in with that green, the same green that I was using a little bit before. And again, I want to kind of set the groundwork for those reflections that are going to be in the water. And while that paper is still wet, I'm just going to kind of work some of those little back and forth vertical marks into this little soup that I've created. And the tree kind of shapes. Just a little bit more color here. Again, got to do this while the paper still has a little bit of moisture in it. Again, clean, dry, paint-free flat brush. Just kind of dab at that a little bit and kind of smear it up and down a little bit.
Oh, wait, Mr. B, are you also recording this?
I am.
Okay.
So we're almost at the end of the period. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the underpainting pretty much today, and I'll just pick up where I left off tomorrow. What I'll do is, again, I'm taking the brush, dry brush, obviously, while everything's still kind of wet, and I'm just going to kind of scrape across this a little bit, and I'm just going to create, what we'll end up kind of reading is like ripples in the water. And I guess the key to that is, like, don't overdo it. Don't keep them too consistent looking. But this is what's going to give you a little effect of whatever's reflecting back down into the water. All right. I feel like I've got what my start is going to need to be over here for that. My water is getting closer and closer to being done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit more green. I'm going to mix it with a little bit of the red just to make a deeper, darker sort of green. Round brush involved. I feel like I want to make a couple little bit more darker shadow in. Let's see if this is too dark. Okay, good. And while everything is still kind of wet, get my flat brush, which is not that clean anymore. I'm gonna clean it off, dry it off, just kind of pull at those little marks, blotches that I made while everything's still a little wet. If I start to feel like on this part where I'm blending in that it's like it's painting, I'm gonna just wipe the extra paint off my brush. I don't end up making some big dark green streaks. I'll just clean my brush off a little bit. If I don't like something, it's gotten too much, get a little bit of water it down, just touch it up, dab it up a little bit, and kind of pull those little marks down. And the paper got a little bit on the dry side. Make some of those little ripples again. Well, that's going to have to get covered up again anyway, but we're building in layers regardless, so it's okay. All right, so I'm getting a bit of my water done. I've got a rough sort of set of patches of where my trees are going to be, so I don't have completely white paper behind it. The mountain edge really is not going to be involved with too much more painting. I'm not going to add more than that. I just wanted a nice crisp edge over here, and I'm keeping it fairly light and going lighter as it gets down towards the horizon. A little touch of color for my sky. Good place as any for me to let this kind of dry a little bit, and then what we're going to do tomorrow is I'm going to come back and I'm going to start working on creating some of the actual like painting of the tree and give you something that looks a little bit more like actual woodlands.